My name is Sean Latham. I'm the editor of The World of Bob Dylan, an exciting new collection of essays on Bob Dylan that's arriving on his 80th birthday, and that gathers together a whole collection of scholars and critics talking about all aspects of Dylan's career. I also serve as the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English at the University of Tulsa, where I serve as director of the Dylan Institute and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. We're really excited about the world of Bob Dylan because it brings together such a phenomenal collection of 27 different scholars and critics and teachers who are covering all aspects of Dylan's career. We have some of the leading cultural commentators in the United States, including music critics Grail Marcus and Ann Powers, as well as a whole diverse array of teachers. We have high school teachers writing for this book. We have professors of philosophy, professors of religion, professors of music and English, all coming together to try to illuminate the rich tapestry of all of Dylan's artistry, not just his music, but his art, his sculpture, his films, his performance, and his vast and complicated connection to contemporary popular culture. We think this is a really important book for many different reasons. One is just the high quality of the scholarship that's here. And that scholarship matters because we're at a pivotal point in Bob Dylan's studies where we're shifting from the sort of era of fandom. Dylan, of course, is still alive. He's just about to celebrate, as I said, his 80th birthday itself, a sort of extraordinary 8 decades of creativity and invention and constant reinvention. But much of the work that's been done up to this point has been based on Dylan's fans, on people that love the music, and that produces a certain kind of writing and a certain kind of appreciation of Dylan in the moment, both being excited about the work that he's doing, often critical of the work that he's doing. I like this album, I don't like this album. It tends to be, in that sense, evaluative and contextual, sort of confined to the moment. But with the arrival of the Bob Dylan archive and the opening of that archive here in Tulsa, we're reaching this moment where we're going to shift from fandom to scholarship, where we're going to acknowledge that Dylan is perhaps the singularly most important and influential artist from the latter half of the 20th century, and that understanding why that is and how that works is going to take decades of digging into his papers, his materials, and really bringing the sensibilities of a scholar to bear, which means putting Dylan's work in the long context of American history, of American politics, of American culture, and of world music and world culture. And so this collection, we hope, marks that pivot point, that moment where we turn away from worrying about, I hate this album and I love this album and Dylan's betrayed me somehow, to here's how we can understand the multiple transitions in Dylan's career. Here's how we can understand the different layers of borrowings and transformations that can produce some of his greatest albums. And doing that work, as I said, sort of it not only takes the expertise of scholars that can speak to that long tradition, but it takes, in our view, a diversity of different kinds of scholars. That's why we have such different kinds of contributors to this volume. As I said, we have professors of philosophy, we have professors of religion, we have high school teachers, we have English professors, we have musicologists, and that diversity of opinion is also going to be essential to what this volume provides. We decided to put this collection together in part because I happen to be just an extraordinarily lucky guy. I happen to be working here at the University of Tulsa when the Bob Dylan archive was acquired and it was announced that it was going to move to the city of Tulsa, that they'd be building a Bob Dylan Center and a Bob Dylan archive here. My own scholarly expertise, I've been trained as a Joyce scholar. That's what I came to Tulsa to do. Tulsa also happens to be the sort of global home of James Joyce studies, so I knew a great deal about how to do work on a singular figure. And I often see Dylan as sort of the latter 20th century's answer to the early part of the 20th century. If James Joyce was maybe the most influential and important figure in the early part of the 20th century culture and literature, Dylan is the sort of same figure for the second half of the 20th century. And so it seemed to me that we needed to do what had been done for James Joyce sort of in the 1950s, which was that same process of shifting from fandom and scandal and outrage to understanding why this book could make such a cultural impact. And so because I had access to the archive, because we had started this Dylan Institute, that seemed like this is the first and most important thing we could do is build a collection of of essays like this that would seek to assemble all of this expertise and begin what we think will be now, as is the case with James Joyce or Dickens or others, a century-long conversation about Dylan's importance, impact, and legacy. Dylan is sort of an interesting figure because you can go to any bookstore or collection and see that there are hundreds of books of Dylan on the shelves. Some of them are extremely strange. We've actually just acquired a collection here at the Institute I direct that, kind of one-off paper books, lots of self-published studies. So there's a huge collection of work that's been done on Dylan, but it also tends to be often quite good, but also often quite eccentric. It's born out of people's obsessions with a particular album or particular era. One thing that Dylan himself has always been sort of suspicious of and tried to resist is the idea, of course, that he's the voice of a generation, that somehow he's a singular figure of the 1960s, despite the fact that by now the vast amount of his work falls in the period outside the 1960s. And so that eccentric work tends to latch into, is Dylan still a Christian or not? And how should we understand his Christian faith? Or did he really betray the 60s or not? So this is what I mean by it being relatively eccentric. And so I think of this book less eccentric. As I said, it brings to bear all kinds of scholarly expertise. And instead, what we're offering is something that's more kaleidoscopic, right? That there's no one Dylan that we're trying to produce in this book. And often most of the other work that you'll see on Dylan is one person's eccentric view of an artist with whom they've often become obsessed, healthily or unhealthily. I think this book, in its kaleidoscopic approach, tries to see all the different kinds of Dylans there are, all the different kinds of angles of approach that might lead fans and readers and people that have never heard of or understood Bob Dylan before into his work. And I think that's the other, when the question of why do a book like this now? Isn't there enough stuff on Dylan out there? Well, I think a book like this can speak to people who don't know anything at all about Dylan, but just know that there's something important about him. We set out in writing this book to make sure that the essays would be broadly and widely accessible to people who didn't know anything about Dylan, but knew that he had something to do with country music or knew he had something to do with the civil rights movement. And so we hope that each of these chapters offers a sort of way in to some aspect of Dylan's career that can be widely and broadly accessible, exciting to those who already know something about Dylan, and a portal of discovery for those who just know that this is a name you're supposed to know something about. I've come to find Dylan interesting for a number of different reasons, and I say come to find because I was born in 1971. I didn't really listen to Dylan, so as I was listening to music and my own musical tastes were shaping, that was in the 1980s, often considered sort of a low point for Dylan. He just wasn't that big a musical figure in the music of the 1980s. So I didn't really know a great deal about Dylan as he wasn't integral, I guess, to the shaping of my musical taste at the time. But then as I began to listen to some of the older music, I became really interested and excited about it. As I came to understand myself as a kind of cultural critic, I came to understand Dylan's importance. And then as I began, as I said, with the arrival of the Dylan Archive and the opportunity to look into it and to understand what's there, I became increasingly excited about Dylan because of the parallels that he has with some of the other great cultural figures of the 20th century. And I've used James Joyce as an example. I think Eliot or Woolf are also quite powerful examples. These are figures that are incredibly synthetic. That is, I'm interested and excited about Dylan, not just because of his creativity, but because of the way in which he understands himself operating in a tradition, the way that he himself makes art and music by assembling different parts of the past into new and often surprising or exciting mosaics, and the work of unpacking that, of understanding how a song works, and understanding it's not just because Dylan sat down and dashed off a few lines and set a couple of guitar chords to it, but because Dylan had set himself to study a tradition, whether it's the blues or the American songbook, right? Whether or not he was reading Civil War histories or the poetry of Whitman and trying to build all of those pieces into what then would become a commentary on contemporary American cultural, political, social life. I think that's what's exciting about Dylan, is that each song is like Alice's Looking Glass. You just kind of fall into it and realize that it contains depths and multitudes that reward further listening, further study, further thinking, further writing. Dylan's continuing relevance today is sort of instantly legible in the sense that nearly any contemporary pop artist that you want to listen to of some stature has probably covered a Bob Dylan song. So the music that you're listening to now, in one sense, they're literally just replaying Dylan songs because they discover some of the things that I've discovered, that to understand something about American musical history is to listen to a Bob Dylan song, to understand why the songs that you're making in 2021 have certain kinds of country or folk roots that came through rock, but that Dylan helped trace that sort of path. So one, just understanding that contemporary pop music isn't this just piece of candy that's being produced by a factory, but is in fact a complex thing worth listening to and thinking about. Dylan teaches us that lesson. And one of the reasons Dylan was so important, remains so singularly important a figure, is he taught us that pop music can be serious, right? That he wrote his initial sort of music exploded when it did, because he was responding to the sort of era of rock and roll where it seemed like rock was going to be just a flash in the pan because it was all about sort of teenage boys and girls falling in love and falling out of love. And so there were falling in love songs and breakup songs. And Dylan added to that a deeply poetic sensibility that has made pop music still what it is today. I mean, he's a foundational figure because he told us pop is serious, and this is serious art, and it can do serious kinds of work. The other thing I think that makes Dylan incredibly relevant today, and perhaps still at this particular moment, is because Dylan, I think more than any other artist, is aware of his historical roots. He thinks about the important fact, he thinks often and regularly about the important fact that American pop music, still as we understand it and practice it today, came from the traditions of American minstrelsy, right? From slavery, from racism, and that to understand and make music today is to understand that it has a racist past, and that grappling with the contentious issues around race and what we owe to the past and what burdens the past might place on us and how we build survivable futures in what often seems like an irresolvable or unrecoverable past. That's the work Dylan does. I can give you just the example of one song you should listen to is Blind Willie McTell, I think often considered one of Dylan's greatest masterpieces. He didn't actually release it when he first recorded it, where he sings explicitly about what he owes to this past. And I can't think of a more powerful meditation on our moment, where we think about Americans' racist past, how race shapes so much of contemporary American culture and identity. And there you hear Dylan wrestling with it, and wrestling with it as we listen to this song. And so listening to him wrestle with the problem that is seizing American culture and politics at this very moment as Black Lives Matter protesters take to the streets, is to understand that Dylan is still speaking to us because he's still doing our work. He's doing the work of culture, of both remembering and of assembling something from those memories. Dylan's an extraordinary figure in the same way that James Joyce is an extraordinary figure from the early part of the 20th century, in the same way that Dickens is an extraordinary figure from the 19th century, or Whitman. Because these are artists, we only have a few in any given sort of generation or half century or century that have this synthetic ability, this ability to pull so much of the past together, and in doing that, build something new. Dylan built something fundamentally new. He built pop music into whatever we want to call it, rock, into poetry, right? I mean, we can think of, in some sense, in the early 20th century and in the 19th century, poetry was everywhere. It was in every popular magazine. It was in newspapers. It was just the currency of the day. People memorized it. It was everywhere. We never lost that. It just shifted onto the radio and out of the magazines. And the person that did that was Bob Dylan. He's the one that said that stuff that you're hearing that rhymes on the radio, it's not just light stuff to listen to on your way to work, right? It's also something that you can put on a record player with friends. It's a thing you can listen to with them and talk about. It can make you feel, it can make you hurt, right? And I think that process in particular, right, of making us understand that poetry never went away. In fact, it's probably more relevant and more prevalent in our lives right now. We probably collectively know and can recite more poetry if we think of pop music as poetry than anybody in the 19th century could. And that's in part thanks to Dylan, because he told us you can find yourself in here, and you can find not just yourself falling in and out of love, you can find your anger and your hurt and your confusion and your frustration and all the confusion and terror of being a human. Dylan can put all of that into a song and feel like he's telling you something about what it means to be a self at all different points in your life. That the other thing that makes Dylan extraordinary, and this is probably an important part of his legacy as well, is over now 80 years of his life, right? Dylan has lived a full life. So his early poetry is about the fury of youth, right? His early music is about the fury of youth. He has lots of amazing middle-aged albums about what it means to be a father, about what it means for a marriage to end. Some of his greatest work has been produced in his 70s as he's becomes this kind of cranky and also, I think, furious old man, right? Who's looking back on a life that he's of and an entire era of American history and culture, and looking at it with a cold and honest eye that I think still has the power to shock and rankle us. So that ability of Dylan's poetry to sort of cover the full diversity and complexity of a human life, to not just be, as I said, the fury of youth, but to cover all of those different aspects of human life, is also something that Dylan has given us that I think very, very few artists, pop artists, musical artists of any kind have given us before. Because this book has 27 different chapters, it can bring all kinds of new insights and discoveries to Dylan's work. I've already talked a bit about the diversity of the topics and the contributors that you'll find in here. I think one of the important things that you'll learn in this book is something about the meticulousness of Dylan's songwriting, and this is something that only comes in part with studying the archive and the bootlegs and all of the sort of material that we now have access to understand how Dylan works, is to understand that each song that he produces is a carefully crafted and well-made thing, something that's gone through multiple iterations, both on the page and in the studio, and that itself has this huge background of research and invention behind it. And as far as particular new insights, I think there are some really surprising things here. Ann Powers, for example, I think has a particularly striking and powerful essay on Bob Dylan's body. We asked her to sort of say something about Dylan and gender, and what she's produced here is a sort of amazing catalog of all the different ways that Bob Dylan's body has changed over the course of the career, and the way he's used that as part of his performance, something I think we tend to overlook beyond maybe the hair, which she does write briefly about. But she talks about changing ideas of masculinity in American culture, for example, in the ways in which we could literally track that in the ways that Dylan dresses and performs on stage. I think another one of the exciting essays that you find in this volume is by Gail Wald, who's written a phenomenal piece on Dylan and gospel music. And we often think about Dylan and gospel being just tied to 3 albums that were produced in the 1980s when it appears Dylan briefly converted to Christianity. But what Wald reminds us is that Dylan's entire sort of working life has been tied up in some ways with gospel music because of its connection with African American music and spirituality, the ways in which that music intersects with and diverges from the blues, which is also integral to Dylan's work. Wald gives us an entirely new racial history, I think, for understanding Dylan's work, debts, and obligations. This book, of course, has the benefit of some of the authors being able to work with materials that are in the Bob Dylan archive as well. And so there's a really exciting essay in here by Michael Kramer on the counterculture in Woodstock, in which he was actually able to make use of one of the amazing treasures that is held in the Dylan archive, which is a collection of about 9 tiny little notebooks that Dylan clearly had on hand with him while he was making the basement tapes in Woodstock and in the 1960s, sort of after his motorcycle accident. And recording what would become basically the foundations of what we would call the roots genre in American music, and launching the career of the band at the same time. So Kramer is actually able to look at and use the material in these notebooks, which contain drafts for hundreds of unpublished songs, sometimes just a line or two, sometimes complete songs. You can see how the basement grows into albums like John Wesley Harding. And so Kramer's able to make use of that and to talk about Dylan's complicated relationship to the counterculture, and why, when Woodstock came to Woodstock, New York in 1969, Dylan got the hell out and didn't want to have anything to do with it, and instead gave a concert on the Isle of Wight that was sort of competing against Woodstock. There's other stuff in here as well. There's an essay by Larry Starr, for example, on these most recent Dylan albums that are all covers of the Great American Songbook that shocked everyone. Like, why is Dylan, with his cracked and broken voice, trying to record the great crooners of the 1940s and 50s? And Starr helps us understand that process and why these albums and these covers are so important. These are just a few of the treasures. I said there are 27 different essays. So, and one of the things we really like about this book is the fact that you don't read, it's certainly possible to read this chapter to chapter, one right after the next, but it also rewards just diving into whatever seems interesting to you and letting it set your itinerary. So if you're interested in country music, you can start with the essay on sort of country music, go back and read something about Johnny Cash. Earlier, read something about the archive and all of the sort of country music that Dylan was listening to in the 1960s while he was making things like John Wesley Harding. It allows you to set your itinerary in all kinds of different ways rather than just be guided one chapter to the next. Surprising Dylan fans in some sense can be difficult, at least the hardest core of Dylan fans. But I think the surprise is not going to be in here's a new bootleg that no one's ever heard, right? Instead, I think the surprise is going to be the contexts around which we can now understand Dylan's music. I mentioned something already about the American Songbook. There's a terrific essay in here by a woman named Devin Powers, who used to be a music critic for the Village Voice and is now a professor of marketing at Temple. And she writes a great essay on Dylan's brand and the ways in which Dylan as a sort of brand and concept has changed over the course of his career and the ways in which that is still changing and being managed. There's a phenomenal essay as well by Jim English from the University of Pennsylvania and an expert actually on prizes and literary prizes, who writes about Dylan's receipt of the Nobel Prize. And I think some of the insights that he offers will be quite surprising to fans too, because he immediately moves back. Does he deserve it, or he moves past, does he deserve it or doesn't he? Is this literature or not? To the sort of larger cultural context of what prizes are, what it means that Dylan gets these, and what that tries to tell us about how we're navigating our own relationship and understanding to Dylan as a cultural figure. So the Bob Dylan Archive is an extraordinary collection of Dylan's materials that he'd assembled over the course of his life. My understanding is that it had been largely kept in a warehouse, and it covers roughly, I would say, the period from when Dylan stopped sleeping on people's couches in New York and sort of began to have a place of his own, or at least had sort of more stable places that he could live in, especially in Woodstock. And basically covers all of the material up through just a few years ago when the archive was acquired and moved here to Tulsa. And it is an extraordinary collection because it contains some 100,000 objects, studio tapes, photographs, films, and letters, and pages of notebooks and song drafts written on advertisements and hotel stationery, stuff torn out of random notebooks or books. Just to think about the scope of that, 100,000 objects is just an extraordinary collection of material, and it's a monument to what I've been saying all along, which is that the work that Dylan does, the songs that he makes, they're well crafted, they're researched, they're reworked constantly, and they've left this incredible paper trail that we can go back and trace. We can trace the songs that Dylan didn't publish for any reason. We can see songs taper off on the page and suddenly burst into life somewhere else. As we've already seen on some of the official bootlegs that have been released, you could begin to hear the work that Dylan does in the studio. So some work gets done on the page, Dylan brings those pages into the studios, and then a different kind of alchemy happens when he's with a producer or with other members of the band that he's trying to direct, and you can hear even extraordinary songs like a Rolling Stone, for example, take shape in really weird and unexpected ways. As a waltz, for example, it was its first iteration, and then it falls sort of apart as the musicians try to play it, right? And then sort of surges to life into the more familiar form that we've come to know it when they change the time signature and rearrange the instrumentation and speed it up. And so you can see that process of a genius at work, right? That's what the Bob Dylan Archive more than anything gives us, is the evidence of a genius at work on the one hand, and the context of that life right? So that when you look at these notebooks and from the Woodstock era, for example, that I've been going through, you get Dylan's to-do list, like remember to go get a driver's license, right? Alongside a draft for a song from John Wesley Harding, right? You get Dylan's own collection of like songs he clearly wants to go listen to that he's heard on the radio. So just lists of songs, lists of Bible quotations. Dylan's clearly, as we knew from the music during the Woodstock era, Dylan's reading the Bible pretty intently. And here we can see the evidence of that. And then we can see him sort of take Bible verses and try to rewrite them himself into songs. So that, and in some, this is the kind of thing that an archive like this reveals. One of the curious things that's happened, or one of the exciting things really that's happened with the acquisition of the Bob Dylan archive, is the creation of a Bob Dylan Center here in Tulsa. That's going to be a sort of museum that'll tell something about the story of Dylan's life, but also something about his impact and his long legacy and the impact he's had on all kinds of other writers and artists. So that's going to be based here in Tulsa. It will be the primary sort of public point of access to the archive and its treasures. It will open. COVID has obviously changed some of the planning around when it will be open, but I think we can say that once the pandemic has begun to ease and travel becomes safe again, so I would imagine sometime next year that center will open. And what will really make it an exciting thing is not just that Tulsa, of all places, will become this kind of mecca for Bob Dylan studies, but that it's going to be located basically 2 doors down from the Woody Guthrie Center here in Tulsa, which is also holds all of Woody Guthrie's papers and archives, right? And Dylan, when he first started out as a musician, modeled himself on Woody Guthrie, tried to write songs like Woody Guthrie, dressed like Woody Guthrie, talked like Woody Guthrie. So you have that kind of, these two things belong together. And so you can come here and understand this kind of history. And I think those two things, when together, are going to become a magnet for other kinds of archives. We already, for example, the Woody Guthrie Center has the Phil Oakes archive here. And I think the Dylan archive will become a magnet for more and more kinds of materials that will make this a more and more powerful place to do research on American roots music. And I should add that both of these museums are going to be based about a block away from another museum called OK Pop, which is the sort of state historical museums here, history of Oklahoma popular culture, and Oklahoma's distinguished in many ways by its musical history. This is the place where Western swing, for example, took shape. And so all of that kind of rich musical history, from Leon Russell to Wanda Jackson, people that actually worked with Dylan, right? All that material is going to be based here. So this is really going to help make Tulsa into a city that will become a center for the study of roots music, broadly conceived in the Americas. So I'm often asked what my favorite Bob Dylan album is, and of course it's an impossible question. It's like picking a favorite child, I suppose, or something like that. I will say that as a kid, I was initially drawn by Highway 61 Revisited, Dylan's great rock album, I think, of the 1960s, and especially the song Like a Rolling Stone, that moaning sort of how does it feel? It really spoke to me as a teenager because it sounds at once furious, right? He's sort of taunting this woman in the song, but also curious. He's kind of jealous, it seems, of her ability to be cut loose from all ties. And as I grew up, I suppose, I became more and more interested in the song and the courage of a song like Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, and Patti Smith's performance of it at Dylan's Nobel celebration told you everything you need to know about just how powerful and timely that song has remained. It's like a time traveler. It speaks to every moment that you hear it, I think. But I'll say more recently, if you really are going to make me pick one, the album Love and Theft, infamously released on September 11th, 2001, is the song that I teach every time I have an opportunity to do so, because it reflects a lot of what I've said today, the sort of depth of Dylan's study, the sort of ability of an artist in the later part of his career who has under his belt a lot of experience, a broad palette of listening and reading, and an artist who, as I said, throughout the 90s hadn't really been doing a lot of extraordinary work. This thing came out of nowhere and transformed the idea of what an album, I think, could be and could do. One story that we know is true and that has always stuck with me about Dylan is not a charming anecdote. but is from 1963. Dylan's very young. He's just become famous, really, and he's been given a Civil Rights Award. And he goes to accept it in December. This is just after the assassination of Kennedy, right? This transformative moment in American history. And he sparked outrage by apparently a bit drunk while he gave his acceptance speech, saying that he also saw something of himself in Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy's assassin. And he later tried to clarify what he meant by that. I mean, as you can imagine, the dinner broke down. People were furious at him. He wrote an apology afterward that was only a kind of apology. Because I think that I like that story because it tells us why Dylan is actually important. He is courageous. He's not afraid to tell the truth about himself and to say there's a kind of, yes, Kennedy was this great figure, but there was a lot of fury in American culture in the 1960s, right? And that Kennedy can look one way for a certain kind of nostalgic white male baby boomer, and I think for certain kinds of people, African Americans, immigrants, there are lots of people who can also look at that Kennedy story and the idea of Camelot and the beauty of America in the 1960s as having nothing that speaks to them. And so Dylan's, I think, honesty to say there's a lot wrong there, and I can understand the fury of a culture that can't take this anymore, and feels itself trapped and needing to respond in desperate ways is what Dylan never stopped doing, right? It was what makes him into a poet, right? Is that poet's ability to tell the truth about himself and to do it despite it all, right? Despite what it might mean for his fame or his image. And that ability, I think, to share the things that most of us would struggle to admit is what makes Dylan great. And it's why this story remains for me one of my favorite stories about Dylan, even though I'm not sure that it's one he necessarily even once repeated or carried on. We're releasing this book for Dylan's 80th birthday. I will resist the temptation to call it a birthday gift. I suspect that Dylan is not particularly sentimental about such things. And if I had to offer him a birthday message, I suppose happy birthday, of course, would be the easiest and most simple thing I could say. But really, I think the most important thing that I can say is simply thank you, right? Thank you for giving shape and sound to so many aspects of the modern American experience. And thank you for the courage that I've tried to describe, right? The courage to keep digging, to keep experimenting, and to keep inventing, right? That you can still go to a Dylan concert and be shocked that he's reinvented his most familiar songs. And that relentless dedication to creativity and reinvention is both an extraordinary feat unto itself, and it tells us something about a kind of, this may be romantic, right? But there is something romantic about that American urge to just keep reinventing. Dylan's never going to fall into a greatest hits mode, right? He's never going to stop pushing forward and trying to change things. And so I'm grateful for that, and for his ability to therefore keep teaching us about the new capacity and power of song.